Committee on Rules will now come to order. There have been requests for cameras, and if the chair hears no objection, the television coverage will be permitted without objection. Today we meet under very unusual circumstances. The first committee meeting of each Congress is usually filled with very undramatic matters of organization. In this Congress, we just don't have the luxury of an organizational meeting. We're all too aware Iraq illegally occupies Kuwait today, despite United Nations resolutions condemning Hussein's action and insisting that Iraq withdraw by January 15th, despite sanctions and despite the buildup of Allied troops in Saudi Arabia. Iraq remains in Kuwait. The United States resolution authorizes the use of military force or whatever means are necessary to ensure that Iraq withdraws if they haven't done so by January 15th. Secretary of State Baker told Iraq's foreign minister that the last chance for peace is withdrawal by January 15th. The president maintains he now has the authority to use force to oust the Iraqis. Anytime after midnight Monday, it is possible that the commander-in-chief may commit United States troops to battle. If we believe that offensive military action ought to be authorized in advance by Congress, we must act this week. Let me explain how I intend to proceed today. We have two new members of the committee on the Republican side, and I'd like to welcome Representative McEwen and Representative Dreyer. And it's my intention in a moment to turn to the new ranking minority member, my friend Mr. Solomon, to officially introduce the new members of the committee. After the introductions, the chair will entertain a motion to adopt temporarily the committee rules from last Congress without amendment, and by the end of this month, the committee will act on any changes to the rule if any are required. And at that meeting, we will also take up any other necessary organizational matters. And after the committee rules have been adopted for today, we will turn to the Persian Gulf resolutions. Mr. Solomon, welcome back from Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I'll be brief. I want to thank you for your opening comments, and also to tell you that on my right is my good friend Jimmy Quillen. And just in case you think you can push around this little country boy from Glens Falls, New York, I've got Jimmy on my right-hand side that knows all about it, and I really appreciate it. I've got two good men over here, David Dreyer, who comes to us from the Banking Committee from California, an outstanding Republican member, and certainly Bob McEwen, a member of the Public Works and Transportation Committee, but more importantly, the Intelligence Committee, serving with our good friend Tony Bielenson. And it's a pleasure to have both you gentlemen here. If I might just say so, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you, and I want to thank Speaker Foley. As I said at a press conference with Ranking Minority Member Michael and Mr. Broomfield and Mr. Solars, we do appreciate the openness in which this debate is going to take place, and certainly members of this House are not going to be gagged, and I think you on your side are to be commended for that. I just returned from Saudi Arabia with the Majority Whip, Bill Gray, and a bipartisan group of 16 Democrats and 10 Republicans, which made up all spectrums of the political and philosophical area. And I just want you all to know that you would be so proud of the young men and women that are serving in Saudi Arabia today. They are mentally prepared and they are physically capable of carrying out the interests of this country. And I only wish that Saddam Hussein could have seen what we, as a bipartisan congressional delegation, saw when the awesome power of both ground and air forces that are there. And Mr. Saddam Hussein should remove himself Kuwait now, today, in order that we might have peace. And I commend the Mr. Solars and the Mr. Vassell for bringing this resolution before us today, and I thank you very much.
Thank you,
Mr.
Solomon. The chair will entertain a motion from the gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee rules in effect of the adjournment of the 101st Congress be temporarily adopted as the rules of the committee during the 102nd Congress.
Question comes from the motion. Any debate? If not, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The rules are adopted. The committee now would like to recognize the Speaker of the House, the Honorable Thomas Foley. Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to appear very briefly before the committee. As you have said, Mr. Chairman, these are very difficult times. Certainly the issues that are about to be presented to the Congress are momentous issues. I have had, along with Mr. Gephardt, conversations with distinguished Republican leader Mr. Michael, who is here present, and I have emphasized and agreed, and Mr. Michael shares this view, that we should attempt to frame this historic debate and decision in the best terms possible for the expression of the views and conscientious judgment of the members of the House. And to my knowledge, we have no essential disagreements on how that should best be done. So it's my hope that a rule could be agreed upon today and be presented to the floor for action today, notwithstanding the usual requirement for a one-day layover. It seems to me that if there is no essential disagreement, that it might be possible to adopt the rule this afternoon and begin whatever protracted debate will be required by the rule. I would hope that it would be possible for that debate to be concluded by perhaps Saturday, but the judgment of the committee, of course, will be respected as to how long it feels that debate should proceed. It seems to me that the issues are well framed by 3 resolutions which have been presented for this committee's consideration. The so-called Bennett-Durbin resolution, which in its principal purpose affirms the constitutional power of the Congress to implement the war powers provisions of Article 1, Section 8. Secondly, a proposal by Mr. Gephardt and Mr. Hamilton, a concurrent resolution which would endorse the goals of the President of the United Nations in seeking the removal of Saddam Hussein from Kuwait and provide authority for the continued enforcement of the embargo, for the defense of American forces and for the defense of Saudi Arabia, and provide the President with an expedited procedure in the future if he should seek direct desire to implement offensive military action. Finally, a joint resolution offered by Mr. Solars and Mr. Michael, House Joint Resolution 62, I believe it's a number, which would explicitly authorize the use of force to the President in support of the UN resolutions and in accordance with the War Powers Act. I think those are issues which present an opportunity for a meaningful, constructive, and full debate and for decision by the House of Representatives. These are difficult times for our country. They are times, I think, when Americans expect the Congress to exercise its constitutional responsibility and to do so in the spirit of the historic importance that these decisions most probably will have, and in, I hope, a spirit of respect, of mutual respect for the opinion and judgment of every member. I hope and believe that the debate which will ensue in the next day or so will reflect credit on the Congress and on the representatives who are gathered here to express the voice of the American people. I hope, as all of us, I think, do, that even at this late date, some means can be found to achieve the objectives which the country supports in removing Saddam Hussein from Kuwait and to do so without war. But it's time, I think, for the Congress to express its view in more specific detail, and I thank the committee for the opportunity of coming together today to hear these witnesses and to proceed with this proposal. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for your appearance here before the committee. Thank you. The committee will now take up H-Con Res 1 from the Committee on Foreign Affairs to express the sense of Congress that the Congress must approve any offensive military action against Iraq. The committee will be very happy to hear from the Honorable Charles E. Bennett of Florida to be accompanied by Mr. Durbin. Is he here? Mr. Bennett?
I don't believe he is.
All right.
If he comes in, I'd like to have him testify.
Committee was very happy to hear from the Honorable Charles Bennett.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. October 6th last year, I wrote a letter to the President about what I kept hearing about the idea that the President could put our country to war without action by the Congress. The President never replied to that directly, but General Shokroff wrote me a letter, and it was not, in my opinion, responsive to my letter that I'd written. So therefore, I introduced a resolution in Congress on October 19, which is essentially the resolution you have before you today. This resolution asserts the right of Congress, the responsibility of Congress, to be the war-making part of our government. Our predecessors in history, like James Madison, who's known as the father of the Constitution, said this was very important, that the power to wage war would be in the hands of the decision to go to war, would be in the hands of the legislative branch rather than the executive branch, because history had many examples of the horror of having a person, ego or something like that of an emperor or king or what have you, leading to a war that was very injurious to the people. So that's what our ancestors decided, that it should be in the hands of Congress. If you do not act when the responsibility comes to you to act in Congress on such matters, you could eventually make this a nullity. In fact, Mr. Baker, Secretary of State, has many times said, well, there have been 200 instances where the military has been called into action when Congress never authorized it called into action. I read that paper and the backup material about it, and I found out that many of these things are, you might say, just constabulary or police-type actions, nothing of any importance. Just a few people involved. However, there were some others that were of great interest to me, because I'm touched, as most of us are today, by how we've treated our Native Americans, the Indians. And I noticed a number of things like Wounded Knee and things, places like that, where we did enter into what amounted to a war without the sanction of Congress. So I don't think it's a very good record that we've allowed to be accumulated. But Congress can't rush every time into stopping the president. This is something of some significance. But this is a thing of great significance, whether we should go to a major war like the war that's likely to occur in Iraq. So therefore, I felt we should do this. I was not allowed to bring that to the floor in the closing days of the last Congress. And so Mr. Durbin raised this question in a caucus and eloquently pleaded for some action in this area. And so he and I got together and introduced this resolution, which is essentially the same resolution I introduced on October 19 of last year. I must say to you that we're presented with two great problems. They're not the same kind of problem. One problem is whether or not we're going to go to a war, whether we decide to go into a war, whether you let it down the slippery slope of letting somebody else decide, or whether we're going to decide it ourselves in our day, in this moment. The other one is the question of whether we're going to uphold the Constitution. Just a few weeks ago, we put up our hand and swore that we'd uphold the Constitution. And the Constitution clearly gives this power to Congress and not to the executive branch. Some argument has been made that there's some foundation, because of the provision about the commander-in-chief being the president, that somehow or another he has the right to control when you go to war. But there's no historic example that I know of, and I'm an amateur historian myself, having written seven or eight books in the field of history, and one of them really relates very much to this question. The commander-in-chief is the person who carries out the functions of the government as given to him by the government, the decision of whether or not the government has decided to go to war. Well, this is not a normal thing to be in the hands of any commander-in-chief as to whether you go to war. I don't know of an example in history, anybody. Now, of course, there were people like Napoleon who were commander-in-chief and also emperor, and also blessed by the Pope indirectly by his own hand. So there are people like that in history, but there are no commander-in-chief that decided whether or not the government was going to go to war. So essentially this resolution just reiterates the Constitution and says we believe it's an important part of our Constitution, should be upheld, and before we actually go to war, we should have a decision by Congress. It's a simple resolution. If the other two resolutions are voted down, or one of them survives, the other one doesn't, whatever, it's still a good thing to pass this particular resolution because it makes it clear that Congress is not turning its back on the provisions of the Constitution.
Thank you, Mr. Bennett. Mr. Derrick?
Mr. Bennett, assuming that your resolution were to pass and that Iraq were to attack our troops, where does that put our commander-in-chief? Assuming that your resolution has passed.
Assuming it passed, the president, who is also the commander-in-chief, would come to Congress, or Speaker Foley or somebody else, it doesn't take the president to do it, could ask for an immediate action.
Well, I mean, he would have to come to Congress and get Congress's approval before he could respond?
No,
Now, does your, I beg your pardon, excuse me.
no, because this, the resolution, the actual language of the resolution says he can't undertake offensive action. In the deliberations of our forefathers who arrived at the words declaration of war, they may have done so fairly inartfully, except for the fact that it's a truism of legislation that the way in which it evolves into the language you get has something to do with how you're supposed to interpret it. When you bless that language with that background, which is a good solid legal background, then you come up with the idea, the principle that our president does have the right to put troops as commander-in-chief of the troops and as president of the United States into a defensive war, but not an offensive war. And this resolution I have only deals with starting an offensive war. It doesn't imperil him in any way with it, being defensive.
We all are bound by our oath of office to support the Constitution, and I certainly, as you all, want to do that. But, you know, I think we also have to take into consideration that when that provision was written, it took a month to get from the United States to Europe. But now by missile is an hour or two. I mean, I think we're just dealing with a different situation. I don't, you know, I understand what you're saying, and I respect your constitutional problem, but at the same time, I don't want to do anything that is going to keep the president from using his authority as commander-in-chief to protect our troops in the Middle East if they are attacked.
Nothing in this resolution would imperil that. Nothing. Because it deals only with offensive war.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Solomon?
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Bennett, who I consider one of my best friends on the other side of the aisle in the Congress, that I've told you many times, I have
mutual.
deep respect for him. And I don't believe in debating these issues before the Rules Committee. We're here to determine the way it's going to be debated, but nevertheless, it is such an important issue that I'm very much concerned about it. And I do oppose your resolution, and I certainly support the authorization of force resolution, which will be coming before us. That resolution is similar, and I would ask unanimous consent to submit this memorandum to the committee. Tracks legislation that this Congress has adopted many times in the past. For example, in 1955, the Formosan Resolution, authorizing the President to employ armed forces of the United States as he deems necessary in defense of the Formosan, Taiwan, and Pescador Islands. Another situation in 1957, the Middle East Resolution, authorizing the President as he deems necessary to use armed forces in the Middle Eastern countries that is being threatened by a communist-dominated country. In 1962, the Cuban Resolution, same language that we have in our bipartisan legislation before us. 1964, the infamous Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. In 1983, recently, the Lebanon Resolution, and it goes on, and I would submit that for the record. But, Mr. Bennett, I just came back, and I know you served in the military and are decorated and were, in my opinion, a great American hero. But in talking to our troops over there, they are so concerned, as they are in other countries, about a preemptive strike that this unpredictable Saddam Hussein might use. And God knows we know the biological warfare capability he has. We know the chemical warfare he is capable of. We don't know what his nuclear capability is, but I'm just afraid if your resolution became the statute of law instead of the one we are supporting, I'm afraid it would just send the wrong signal. And for those of us, and there are two sides here, those of us that do not believe in the constitutionality of the War Powers Act, we are supporting this resolution authorizing force. By the same token, those on the other side, Mr. Torricelli, who is one of the most outspoken members of this House, believing in the constitutionality of the War Powers Act, as are many of the major sponsors of our legislation. We don't believe that this does away with our own principles. We think that we can still make that argument at a later date, but we can support our troops over there. And that's why I believe we have to. Certainly, I'm going to support making your resolution.
Between the thing which I've introduced and what the other two are. All I wanted to do when I introduced my resolution was to make it clear that we haven't abandoned the Constitution. But those things don't abandon the Constitution. They are in compliance with the Constitution.
Are you going to vote for both of them?
I'm going to myself vote for the Hamilton one.
But not,
and my own, surely.
Yeah, but not for the bipartisan authorization to use force.
No, because it leaves an open door, like the Bay-of-Tonkin resolution. And I don't believe in allowing the president to decide sometime in the future he wants a war.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't want to take
Okay. Mr. Bielenson.
I totally agree with you, Charlie, and Dick Durbin, and the others who are pursuing this particular resolution. I think you're absolutely correct. As someone who, along with many of my colleagues, has rummaged around a bit in the last few weeks or months in the, not only in the Constitution, but in the constitutional debates in the Federalist Papers, I think it's absolutely clear that this power is deposited with the Congress, reposes with the Congress, and it's required of us. And I'm glad that you're bringing this issue to us in such a clear and a stark manner. It's also quite clear to me, and I assume it is also to you, sir, and I suppose it may well be to others, that if in the current situation, if the Congress does not act, that this Article 1, Section 8 position or requirement of the Constitution becomes virtually moot. We've never had a situation before where for 4 or 5 months we know what might happen. Where we're facing this situation. It's an ongoing matter. It's not a matter of quickly responding to some kind of aggression against us or aggression somewhere in the world. We have now, or soon will have, in excess of 400,000 American citizens over there. And all I'm trying to say, to make it very brief, is that if the Congress does not act as it seems clear to many of us the Constitution requires under these circumstances, then that portion of the Constitution just no longer is terribly relevant. My specific question to you, Charlie, if I may, is that, in your opinion, assuming for purposes of argument, and I hope it happens that your resolution is adopted at the outset by people, whether or not they agree with, I mean, depending on how they want to vote on the other matters subsequent thereto. But is it your opinion that the authorizations that are found in the subsequent resolutions, especially Mr. Solar's resolutions, are the functional equivalent of a declaration of war as required and as envisioned in the Constitution, or should it be couched, specifically as an actual declaration of war, as our colleague Mr. Washington is proposing, where you say a state of war is hereby declared to exist between the United States and the government of Iraq?
I think it is an authorization of war. I think it's a declaration of war. I think there was never any intention to have this dramatic thing of the president coming before Congress and asking for a declaration of war, or a piece of vellum or a parchment or something like that with a gold seal and a blue ribbon. I think when you're making an appropriation to send troops material to fight a war with, which you and I will probably do if we don't win on this other thing. In other words, just because I don't want to start the war at this point, doesn't mean that I would not vote for protection and help to the people who are actually fighting the war. But I think that there's no mystique at all about the idea of declaration of war being any document that says we hereby declare war. I think the actions of Congress progressing a war situation are a declaration of war.
I accept your judgment, and that is that members must know in effect that they are voting in support of a declaration of war, at least under certain circumstances. Mr. Solars and the others can define them, but they are being posed, they are being given this historic choice. I mean, that is what they are voting for. It seemed to this member that it would be preferable, frankly, although he would vote against it, this member would vote against it, to actually have a declaration of war, which I think would concentrate people's minds a little bit more, make it even more obvious the seriousness of what they were doing. I'm just afraid that too many members, as someone who is opposed to the Solars Amendment, may vote for it because they can say, well, I didn't really mean to declare war, and I was hoping that this would happen, and I'd like to give sanctions a chance, even though I didn't vote for Mr. Hamilton's amendment. I mean, we have to make sure that members know that in effect, the effect of their vote on the Solars proposition is a declaration of war. Is that not correct?
I'm positive.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Quillette.
Thank you, Chairman. We're faced with a very critical situation. And I think this resolution would play into the hands of Hussein, whom I consider to be a bad individual. The UN resolution adopted gives until January the 15th for him to get out of Kuwait. I'm afraid your resolution today with the cameras here is playing into the hands of Hussein, and I don't think that we should adopt it. I know you are very sincere, and action could erupt on January the 15th. This nation, although a leader, is only one of many who voted for the resolution in the United Nations. And I think there's only one way to go, and that's to support the President of the United States and let all of these resolutions be discussed on the floor and allow members to vent their spleen. But on the other hand, we can't afford to deviate and let Hussein gain more power, and that's what he's been trying to do. To bide time thinking that we would weaken our position and he would not have to withdraw. Now, if the Congress is faced with the situation of declaring war, there is no war. I think we should put it in the hands of the President of the United States the authority to use troops if necessary. Go along with the United Nations resolution. I believe he has that power under the Constitution of the United States. I believe he has the authority. The Congress of the United States should not be led into the path of delaying the action, playing into the hands of Hussein, whom I consider to be a
Nothing here that would delay anything.
Well, I think so. As the gentleman from South Carolina said, missiles are fast and destructive, and they could erupt any moment. Here we're today debating a situation that, to me, the President already has the authority. But be that as it may, I shall vote against your resolution, Mr. Bennett, although I have a high respect for you and your judgment, and I know you're sincere.
I love you as a brother. You're a great guy.
Thank you.
The fact that you're misled on this doesn't affect it. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Floss.
Mr. Bennett, I think Mr. Bielenson put his finger on the matter very precisely, and I just want to go back to that briefly, because it is important procedurally what we're doing here. And your resolution, which presumably will be the first one voted upon, your resolution says that the Congress finds that the Constitution of the United States vests all power to declare war in the Congress of the United States, and then you say any offensive action taken against Iraq must be explicitly approved by the Congress. Now, the Solars resolution does explicitly approve offensive action. So what your resolution and the Solars resolution, if they would both be adopted on Saturday, are not mutually exclusive, and in fact are complementary as I read them.
Exactly.
So that I guess the fear that the gentleman on the other side of the aisle has is that if your resolution were passed and the Solars resolution were defeated, then there would be no authority for the President to go forward. But if your resolution passes and the Solar's resolution passes, then there is authority for the President to go forward.
Absolutely.
And your resolution, as I understand it, is to stake out the position for this purpose and for all future purposes, to make it crystal clear that Congress must be involved before offensive action can be taken.
Correct.
And that the Solar's resolution is the functional equivalent of a declaration of war.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Dreyer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a privilege to be a new member of this committee, and I thought I was leaving the television cameras when I left the banking committee. But anyway, this obviously is a very challenging and difficult time for us. Mr. Bennett mentioned James Madison, and my friend from California, Mr. Bielenson, said he's been rummaging around in the Federalist Papers recently. And James Madison, interestingly enough, was a member of the Rules Committee when he served in the House. And I have to say that from my perspective, it's very clear to me that for us to, in this extraordinary situation, where we have seen a 28-nation alliance put together to try and deal with this crisis, it seems to me that it would be a real mistake for us to do anything that could in any way be interpreted as tying the hands of the President. Now, most all of us have been posed with the question over the past several days, well, does the prospect of a debate in the Congress on this play into Saddam Hussein's hands? And my response is, as Mr. Quillen has just said, clearly it appears that it might provide some kind of boost to Saddam Hussein. After all, he's the guy who, when General Dugan was replaced, he thought there would be a military coup in the United States. And he obviously does not understand the West. My response to that was, that's a price that we have to pay for in this democracy. So my response to you, Mr. Bennett, is, while I'm not supportive of your resolution, I will do everything that I can to ensure that your resolution is considered by every member of the House, and that we'll have a vote to do just that. So I very much look forward to that, although I'll be opposing, and I look forward to the chance to have it considered on the floor.
Well, you're one of the finest members of Congress, but you have a very fine reputation as being a conservative, and it would seem to me sort of strange that you would be supporting allowing the United Nations to tell our country to go to war.
Well, Mr. Bennett, I've not been one of those who has consistently argued in behalf of the United Nations, but now I'm fascinated by the fact that some of the greatest proponents of the United Nations policy have now been critical of the stance that has been taken by the UN. And that's going to be interesting to see as the debate proceeds on the floor. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Weed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bennett, let me preface my remarks by saying that I think it's appropriate that you bring this resolution before the Congress, and I think it was appropriate during the last session of Congress when you attempted to bring this resolution, and I believe it's still timely. I'm forced to go on and say, though, that I think there are a couple of perhaps ironic and even awkward positions that we may be staking out by adopting your resolution, and I do intend to vote for your resolution. But I think Mr. Bielenson and Mr. Frost argued correctly, or put the question to you, if in fact the Solar's amendment would meet the test for explicit congressional action that you have outlined in your resolution. That being the case, I want to pose to you, suppose we make that the Congress takes an action of defeating your resolution, even though there are several of us here who intend to support it. And then in a subsequent action, we pass the Solar's amendment. Would you still then argue that the passage of the Solar's amendment in and of itself does meet the test of explicit congressional action?
Absolutely.
So even by passing the Solar's amendment alone, without passing your resolution, we would exert the congressional action that would maintain this congressional prerogative for future occasions.
Well, it wouldn't be preserved because the last 5 or 6 months we've heard a steady flow of conversation from Mr. Baker and some statements from the President himself looking with utter disdain upon the constitutional responsibility on the Congress to be involved in the war-making authority, or even the possibility that they have any authority to do so. So this meets maybe a little different situation than we had before the election in October, but it meets a very tragic situation today where the executive branch of our country is asserting that it doesn't make any difference what's in the Constitution. The executive branch has the right to go ahead and put this country to war. So it is very important to pass it, whether or not the Solars thing pass or not. But if the Solars thing passes, it will be a declaration of war, in my opinion.
Going on beyond the Solars Amendment, and let us presume for a moment, though I don't think that's going to be the case, that the Solars Amendment fails and the Hamilton resolution passes on the floor of the House. Would you consider the Hamilton resolution and the passage of that a statement of congressional intent that would in some way also meet the test of congressional action that is outlined in either the Constitution or your resolution, at least in the refusal to, at this time, make what amounts to a declaration of war?
Well, I think it is an excellent resolution, and I plan to vote for it. But I think it is strengthened in the area which my concurrent resolution deals by the presence of that. So I think they're supplementary. They support each other. They don't deny each other. The Solars Amendment doesn't deny anything. It just enacts a declaration of war which will be put into effect when the president wants to put it into effect.
Mr. Bennett, while I personally don't believe that the Constitution needs any amplification on this issue, that it is absolutely clear on its face and that any reasonable observer would determine that the president needs to seek congressional approval in order to declare war, and this is certainly tantamount to war in the Persian Gulf situation. I think from the explanation you've given us as to what could be the interpretations of the passage or failure to pass either of these two resolutions would lead us to pass your resolution, because it would be the clearest statement at this point in time that Congress does recognize its responsibility and is considering the question. Thank you.
Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bennett, I just would begin by reiterating what Mr. Solomon and the others have said about our personal affection and admiration for your service in the Congress. And while time will not permit me to elaborate, I would begin with that. I have two quick questions, if I may, about the rule or the resolution that you're proposing. First of all, it says that no offensive action can be taken against Iraq unless it's explicitly approved by the Congress. Now, that doesn't apply to anyone else. But if Iraq were to invade, as you know, it possesses more tanks than Hitler and Montgomery and Eisenhower combined, if it were to use those offensive capabilities against Saudi Arabia, against Israel, against Turkey, as it has against Kuwait, does not this resolution say that the United States could not defend those countries by taking offensive action unless the Congress were to be involved? And does any other nation deserve that cocoon of protection from the responses of the United States military and its president as proposed in this resolution?
Well, I must say, I wasn't really trying to produce another 30-second psalm or introduction to the Constitution. I never expected this to be engraved in stone or anything like that. I was meeting a specific problem that this country was facing, that the president was saying we don't have to pay any attention to Congress. Congress doesn't have to be involved in the war-making power, and it dealt with Iraq. And so I didn't try to solve all the problems in the world. I didn't really try to be a great student or a great philosopher. I just said, Mr. President, don't start an offensive war against Iraq, because you don't have the consent of Congress to do it. Maybe with a big bunch of people sitting around thinking real good, maybe we come up with a better resolution than this. But this tells it like it is with regard to a specific problem that we're facing, and nobody was doing anything about. And so, out of my ignorance or intelligence wits, I came up with this language to meet the exact situation we were confronting. I was not trying to write something for history.
I understand.
I was trying to see to it we didn't go into this war without Congress acting on it.
I understand, and I don't want to be argumentative, but my thought is that if Iraq does choose to invade Israel, Under this resolution, the President could not respond unless Congress first took action. Is that not correct?
The President would have to ask Congress to go to war. I would think if Israel were attacked, it would be a matter of seconds before this Congress acted favorably toward attacking Iraq. I mean, after all, we're not, I mean, there's been something said about how things have changed. Oh, yeah, they've changed a lot, and particularly about communication, because all we're doing right now, I presume, is being seen abroad almost instantly. You know, the great battle of the War of 1812, the most magnificent battle of the lot, the one that Andrew Jackson won, occurred long after the peace treaty had been signed. It was not. It didn't take place while the war was going on. It took place after the war was over. So because of the communication problem. And as today, this will be instant and known in seconds across the world. So that we have changed, but it's changed in a lot of ways. And I don't have any fear about that at all. I don't think that's a problem.
And as I would understand the question, then perhaps the Congress could then be acting long after the conflict had been concluded.
Well, if they attacked Israel, I think the President would call Congress into session immediately, and we would act on it in a matter of 5 minutes.
Because the Congress is known for its swift action in questions of...
Well, Congress doesn't act well on some things, but this has been debated for 5 months.
I'll yield to the gentleman, and then I have one more question.
I'll just point out to the gentleman, having just come from Israel, that is one of the things that we worry about. We have a very fragile coalition of allies, many of which are the Arab nations. And Israel has been, we've tried to keep a low profile with them because we don't want to upset this very fragile coalition. And should there be a preemptive strike against Israel, and this Congress is out of session, then naturally Israel would have to retaliate immediately. That right away could break up this whole fragile coalition that we have. And that's what's wrong, perhaps, with the resolution the gentleman's offering. He says that if a bunch of people had sat around, we could come up with a better one. That's what a bunch of people did. The Republican and majority leaders of this House and of the White House got together. They worked for weeks and months putting together the Solar's Michael proposition, and that's why we really ought to be acting on that and not all of the others put together. I thank the gentleman for leading.
I thank you, and I appreciate your response. If I may, just one more, and this truly goes to the wording. It says that after this offensive action, which of course is an expansion of war, it says any offensive action, and of course that any actions, whether it be a parachute drop or whether it be a missile shot, or those are all offensive actions, not war, as proposed under the Constitution. So this is a significant expansion of what the Constitution actually said. So any offensive action at all must be explicitly approved. And my question is, in your wording of using must be explicitly approved, were you meaning a declaration of war?
Well, a declaration of war, and as a lawyer, I'm telling you the declaration of war doesn't have to be a piece of parchment. It can be appropriations for war material, or it can be the Solar's thing. Those are all declaration of war in the way in which our forefathers drafted the Constitution.
So therefore, it's your thinking on this that the appropriation that we made in October for Desert Shield qualified under your definition as meeting this criterion?
I don't know that Congress ever had the issue of Desert Shield as a war establishing thing. They appropriated funds. I guess some funds have been used. Obviously, they got to come from somewhere. So they were appropriated before, but they were not appropriated in the context of progressing an offensive war.
But an appropriation at this point, in your mind, would be satisfactory to meet what is defined here as
if it's for an offensive war, yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Hall. Mr. Gordon.
Very briefly, Mr. Bennett, as our colleague, or new colleague from California, Mr. Dreyer, mentioned earlier, a case might try to be made by someone that by even debating our policy in the Mideast, that we're giving some type of hope to Saddam that we do not have a full resolve to go forward with the objectives that the President has set out in for our country. And I guess you could take that same assumption and carry it one step forward and say, if we should do away with the constitutional requirement that the Congress declare a war and an offensive action, then we should also do away with the constitutional right of freedom of speech, and that if an individual on the steps of the Capitol or in my hometown or your hometown says that maybe we should should debate the policy in the Mideast, that we should have a requirement, or we should go along with the constitutional requirement that Congress must declare war, then maybe do we put them in jail, you know, or do we somehow try to stop them from talking, because that might also give hope to Saddam? So it appears to me that you are on the right track here, and that although the price for democracy is high, that we've got to pay that price, or whatever war we might fight, and all the wars that we've fought in the past will be for naught. So I appreciate you coming forward with this, and I think that anyone's concerns about a declaration will be resolved with the Solar Amendment.
Thank you. Gentlelady from New York, Ms. Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have any questions. I'm a sponsor of the resolution and certainly support it. As a matter of fact, I think it's critically important that during this debate, so much has been said about whether Congress should or does have a role. And I think this reaffirmation of the congressional responsibility to the Constitution is very important.
Thank you. Let the record show that the Honorable Richard Durbin of Illinois is present. Would you like to add to the debate, Mr. Durbin?
Only briefly. I think there have been some questions raised as to the timing of the consideration of this resolution. I would suggest to you that there will never be a better time. We have, within the context of this resolution, an unambiguous situation where Congress can exercise its rightful constitutional authority. For us to debate this question in the abstract is unlikely, but here we have a specific set of facts that bring us together as an institution challenged to use the congressional authority, or the constitutional authority, which our founding fathers gave to us. I will concede that it has complicated, to some degree, the political discussion and the diplomatic discussion. But this complication could have been avoided completely had President Bush said at any time during the last 5 months that he would abide by the Constitution and come to Congress and ask for specific direction as to whether we should go to war. Failing that, Mr. Bennett and I moved together on this resolution to make certain that this institution would have a voice. I am certain that whatever action is taken on the policy questions presented by Mr. Solars and by Mr. Hamilton will be reported and will be engraved in history for us to consider for many years to come. But I think equally important is this statement of principle. For the first time in at least a half a century, Congress is stating that the Constitution must be followed, and the people of this country must have a voice in this important decision through their representatives in Congress. I thank the committee.
Thank you. Any questions of Mr. Durbin? Any questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The committee is very pleased to have the minority leader, the Honorable Robert Michael, gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee. As you know, in a series of discussions with me, the Speaker has indicated his desire to have the House of Representatives vote on 3 separate resolutions regarding the Persian Gulf crisis, and I happen to be a co-sponsor of one of these, the bipartisan resolution reflecting what President Bush wrote in a letter to the 4 elected leaders of both houses of the Congress on January 8th, when he said, "I request that the House of Representatives and the Senate adopt a resolution stating that Congress supports the use of all necessary means to implement UN Security Council Resolution 678. Such action would send the clearest possible message to Saddam Hussein that he must withdraw without condition or delay from Kuwait. Anything less would only encourage Iraqi intransigence." Now, Mr. Chairman, the Iraqi intransigence of which President Bush wrote was never more explicit than in Iraqi's Foreign Minister Aziz's refusal yesterday to deliver the President's letter to Saddam Hussein. It'd be, in my view, tragedy if the House failed to support the President's request, and our proposed bipartisan resolution, therefore, will reflect the President's desire to have the House go on record as supporting UN Resolution 678. There's a temptation to respond to some of the things that have been said here. That's what we want to authorize, sufficient time for the general debate out there on the 3 propositions. It's my understanding might very well all be considered in the House, and that we would not go into the committee of the whole, and that at the conclusion of general debate, at least in the discussions I've had with the Speaker, that we would have those votes come if it takes an hour debate on each one and a vote, an hour and a vote, an hour and a vote, what I would not want to see is that if perchance we got to the point Friday night where we thought we were ready to vote, we voted on one or so and left the other two to Saturday. If we're going to do it, we ought to do them all three on Friday or all three on Saturday so that there's no mixed message out there as to what we're talking about here. And so I think everyone's going to have an opportunity to speak express their own views. That's the way it should be. And as was indicated by someone here, democracy sometimes has its problems because we have the system we have, but we revel in it because it does offer everybody the free opportunity to say anything they doggone well please with impunity, practically, on the floor of the House of Representatives. That's as it should be. Then we'll trust to the vote. I'm obviously in full support of the very carefully crafted bipartisan resolution that has a distinguished array of members covering the spectrum on both sides of the aisle, and hope eventually that would be adopted. Initially, when I talked to the Speaker, I thought the order would be Gebhardt and Bennett first, ours would be second, and then Gebhardt, Hamilton would be third. I have no real particular feelings on that one way or another. We're not really, I don't think, going to be operating under King of the Hill rule here, so it's kind of academic. I think we're going to, and frankly, I've alerted our members, no need to have a roll call vote, even though it's, same-day consideration, but if it is, I think there'd be no problem in getting that. I simply want to expedite the procedure as best we can, because in view of the Speaker, I would agree, we'd like to get this completed before the weekend, not run into Sunday or Monday, and in the meantime, we still pursue peace through, I guess, for the moment, the Secretary General of the UN. Now, if he can turn the magic key, then of course a lot of this will be academic, except I think it's good that we have the debate. I would caution only one thing against those who would say, that every offensive action, no matter what, would require an action upon the account of the Congress. And we may not be in session, and there may be preemptive strikes. And I'm reminded of a pilot or when we had the Korean War, and whether you go across the Yalu or don't. Is it defensive until you cross the river and then becomes offensive? What happens? We get a preemptive strike and we got a fighter plane rises to the occasion over there, and he phones back, I haven't quite got him into my sights, and I don't think I can make it before I get to the Kuwaiti border. Do I pursue, or do I let him go? The commanding officer probably responds, I don't know, has the Congress met on that resolution yet? That's about how ridiculous that can be under a given set of circumstances. So we want to be mighty cautious about how we tie the hands of any president. Now, we've been fortunate enough to have them for the last several times, and I would hope our Democratic friends would feel that, someday you may win the presidency, and then it's your commander-in-chief, and he's got that very important decision to make. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Michael, the assumptions you made on the order are correct, and as long as we don't have any problem with taking up the rule the same day, and you don't foresee any problem?
I have no problem.
And you don't mind starting this evening after we report the...
I think we ought to.
Okay. And your only request is that the 3 resolutions be voted on the same day?
Yes.
With the intervening time between them 1 hour or so?
And I would consider that doesn't prejudice either party or either side.
Thank you. Any questions? Mr. Frost.
Mr. Michael, on the point you were just raising, I would only make the analogy that it's somewhat comparable to a continuation play in the National Basketball League, and that once the action starts, I think it continues, and I think that if any action is begun, that once we've granted the authority to the President to initiate offensive action, that I don't think he has to keep coming back to us. I would point out that there's actually another very specific portion of your resolution that hasn't been commented on at all that I would like to just mention at this point. And that's the War Powers Resolution requirements on the last page of your resolution. I think it is very significant that this resolution states that this is consistent with the War Powers Resolution. This is something this president and other presidents have contested in the past, have said that they can ignore the War Powers Act. And in fact, this president, you as his representative, are now acknowledging that the War Powers Act is valid, at least for purposes of this resolution. If I may read the language, consistent with Section 8A1 of the War Powers Resolution, the Congress declares that this section is intended to constitute specific statutory authorization within the meaning of Section 5B of the War Powers Resolution. So that this president is acknowledging the validity of the War Powers Act as I read this resolution.
Obviously, it's a very contentious thing. I happened to vote against the War Powers resolution at the time. It's one that's really never been fully tested in the court. It was one of the bones of contention, I'll say quite frankly, in the bipartisan crafting of the resolution. And I think it makes it all the more dramatic that we got members on both sides to agree that for this particular purpose, I think while our presidents have not have refrained from honoring, it as a law, still wanted to comply in the spirit. And so there may be the breaking of a bit new ground here. I mean, if
I would suggest that this is,
well.
with due respect, Mr. Leader, I would suggest this is more than compliance with the spirit. This is actual compliance with the War Powers Act. And I think it is an important precedent, and I think it's a good one.
Thank you.
I don't think we ought to hold the minority leader up. I think we should have the people come behind him explain the bill, and then we can get into details.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Michael, for
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee.
Any other members wishing to testify in this House H. Con Res 1? Mr. Dannemeyer? Gentleman from California, Mr. Dannemeyer.
I appreciate the chance to share briefly some views that I sent around to a dear colleague that should be in your offices today. When this nation looked at World War II and the Korean War and the Vietnam War, we were dealing with nations that were economically pressed, to say the least. But the situation in the Middle East is not that. I was privileged to be a member of the delegation that journeyed to that region after the Labor Day break as a representative of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and some of the Persian Gulf countries, quite frankly, are very wealthy. And I don't begrudge them that, the assets that they have, the oil that produces the commerce for the world. But the reality is that this crisis has caused some windfall income to come into existence to some of these Persian Gulf countries. And I don't think it's unreasonable for the American taxpayer, when we consider this overall issue, to talk to the issue of burden sharing, because our taxpayers are concerned about who's going to pay for this. It's not the whole consideration, but it's a factor. We know that we're adding $400 billion to our national debt this year. We're in deep financial trouble, and I believe that among the issues that need to be discussed on the floor of the House is how we're going to pay for this. And what I'm suggesting is authority for an amendment to be considered that we just add to the bipartisan resolution the requirement that our President and State Department pursue with the Persian Gulf countries the recognition of their responsibility to share some of the cost of this burden. I know that they have so far. I've made a calculation, for instance, that just the increased revenue beyond $21 a barrel that was in existence in August 2 to Saudi Arabia in the last 5 months.
Yes. You're not testifying on the Bennett-Durbin bill.
No, I'm talking about the bipartisan resolution.
Oh, we're on the Bennett-Durbin. It took us that long to get into it to figure out what you were talking about.
That's if I can just conclude.
All right, why don't we conclude?
My comments would be related to the bipartisan resolution. I think it would be appropriate to have an amendment that just says that the President and the State Department are directed to negotiate with those Persian Gulf countries that have enjoyed windfall income from this crisis, that they share equitably in the burden of how this thing's going to be paid for. That's my whole spirit. That's my request.
Any questions, gentlemen? California? Any questions? Thank you very much. Any other members wishing to testify on H-Con Res 1? The resolution that expresses the sense of Congress that Congress must approve any offensive military action against Iraq. If not, the committee will consider the bill as having had a full hearing and go on to the next matter, the House resolution. Just H blank, relating to the Persian Gulf. H-Con Res related to the Persian Gulf. It's unnumbered. The Honorable Dante Fasel of Florida. Do you wish to be joined by anybody at this time, Mr. Chairman? Everybody? I mean the committee, not on the floor. The Honorable William Brumfield of Michigan will join the chairman. What?
I think the number is HJ Res 62, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee. Mr. Broomfield and I are here to address the question of the rule with regard.
Yeah, Mr. Solars will join the panel.
Yeah, absolutely. Just as soon as we get through moving. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, first let me say on behalf of the Foreign Affairs Committee that we appreciate the hearing that you're giving with regard to the rule, and that we're, as chairman, I'm very pleased that we have two of our most distinguished members, not only of the committee, but on the floor of the House, who on the Democratic side are the lead managers with regard to the two issues that will confront the Congress. In one corner will be Mr. Hamilton of Indiana, very respected member of our committee, and in the other corner will be Mr. Solars of New York.
Who's wearing the white stripes?
Who'll be wearing the white hat, Mr. Chairman. And on the Republican side, of course, Mr. Broomfield, who's the ranking Republican of the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Madison Square.
So we're gratified that the committee has the opportunity to play this important role in the debate that will occur on the House floor. And we think it's proper that it should be that way, notwithstanding that in the drafting and the consideration of the two propositions that the discussions went far beyond simply the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I think that that was proper. A matter of this importance needed the broadest possible participation in the formulation of the divergent views that exist with respect to this grave matter. Having said that, it seems to me that the issues are clearly framed. There should be no confusion. And that the leadership on both sides is to be given a great deal of credit for not only allowing the Congress to vote and debate on this issue, which I think is vital, of course, but also for the process by which the issues are framed so clearly that members have a choice that is easily recognizable and debatable. So I start out, and I think we all do, in support of the leadership of both sides with regard to the formation of the rule and the manner in which it's going to be, this issue is going to be presented to the Congress. And that's your responsibility. As we understand the theory of that right now, there would be ample time for general debate starting immediately as soon as the rule is adopted, and that there seems to be no opposition to the rule being presented today and debate starting today. All of us, I believe, do agree with that and think that's what should be done. And I gather that it is the intention then to proceed with debate all day tomorrow, general debate. And we're in perfect agreement with that. We think everybody ought to have ample opportunity, and that length of time between today and all day tomorrow on a matter of this importance should be sufficient, and if it's not, then the Rules Committee will have to think of something else. We also agree generally that the idea expressed by the minority leader is a good one. The votes should come ad seriatim in the same time frame. It would be a mistake to allow it to happen any other way, gentlemen.
That's going to be handled in the rule, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, well, I'm addressing the rule. So, and I think that with 1 hour on each issue after the general debate as you proceed to the vote is a very fair way and a good way to handle it, and I commend it to you. I would offer a consideration here with regard to the bipartisan resolution that Solars and Michael and a whole host of others have co-sponsored. I think we're agreed that the Bennett vote should come first. I want to point out to others, if you haven't thought about that it's a concurrent resolution, does not go to the President. It's a statement of the position of the Congress, reaffirmation of the Constitution. That's another matter, and I will speak on that if I get a chance sometime in the debate. And I just parenthetically, I intend to support it, of course. Now, with regard to H.J. Res. 62 and the bipartisan resolution, I want to say that you know, as long as we get ample time and it's divided equally and fairly, we got no problem. Now, normally, the chairman of the committee would be involved in the delegation of the time and the control of the time, Mr. Chairman. I'm here to tell you that I'm not that sensitive, or insensitive, let me put it that way. I recognize the difficulty that exists here, and I'm perfectly content if the Rules Committee makes it in order so that the principals who are espousing the points of view on the divergent theories would be managers of the time. I think it's a lot more clear-cut and cleaner, and everybody will be happier, so that the respective sides would have no question in their own minds about who's doing what to whom. They can have a clear shot. So I would suggest that at least on the Democratic side, that you have Lee Hamilton handling the time, and I don't presume to be the leader here, but if you're going to do that, then have Mr. Solars handle the time on the Democratic side, and on the Republican side, I guess Mr. Broomfield will be handling all the time. Am I correct?
Working with Bob.
You're working that out. So whatever, if it becomes necessary to be explicit in the rule, I'm saying, in other words, that whatever the Rules Committee works out with regard to delegation time will not cause me any heartburn, personally. I thank you. In regard to other matters, I'll be glad to answer any questions you want.
Well, Chair,
I don't, you know, if you want to go into substance, I'd be glad to debate this all day, but
I think we'll get plenty of substance on the floor. The Speaker is very strong about allowing ample time so that nobody will be shut off at any time.
I think it would be good if you would let the bipartisan resolution be voted on second in order. I don't see any particular advantage or disadvantage, but since it is the administration request principally, you might want to consider that as, but if for some reason somebody sees any advantage in reversing the order.
Well, I don't think there'd be much advantage one way or the other. In fact, if you've heard Mr. Michaels that he
no, I
care,
understand.
Settled for
I understand. I've said all I want to say, unless you want to ask me anything. How about my colleagues here?
We'll hear from the panel first, then we'll open up.
Well, I'm here basically to support Chairman Fassel's comments. I think the most important thing would be that if the final votes come on Saturday, that we have all the votes at the one time with an hour preceding it for debate. I want to compliment Mr. Solars and a number of other people who have worked very hard in putting this resolution together. I think we do have a resolution that will be in the interest of our country, and I'm basically in support of, obviously, of the bipartisan resolution, which I think is would be the most effective. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you. Solars.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I completely associate myself with the remarks of Chairman Fasell and Mr. Broomfield. I will be brief, but I hope you will forgive me the indulgence of a very short personal observation. It was almost 25 years ago to the day that I got my start in politics as the campaign manager for one of the first anti-war candidates for Congress in the entire country. And I must say then that it never occurred to me, a quarter of a century later, that I might be appearing before the Rules Committee of the House of Representatives, asking them to make in order a joint resolution of which I would be the primary sponsor, together with 23 other very distinguished Democrats and Republicans, authorizing the President to use force in a situation which some people have characterized as another potential Vietnam. George Santayana once said that those who do not study the past are condemned to be repeated. But we equally must not be enslaved by the past. And I believe there are some very fundamental differences between the situation in which we found ourselves a quarter of a century ago in Indochina and the situation that we confront in the Persian Gulf today. In Vietnam, I never felt we had vital American interests at stake. In the Persian Gulf, we clearly do. In Vietnam, the war dragged on for years and ended in an American defeat. In the Persian Gulf, if we do go to war, I believe we are likely to win a decisive victory in a matter of months, if not weeks. And finally, whereas in the case of Vietnam, the costs in blood and treasure of our commitment there were out of all proportion to the potential benefits of a successful defense of South Vietnam, in the case of the crisis in the Gulf, the potential benefits of a successful effort to get Iraq out of Kuwait far exceed, in my judgment, the potential costs that would inevitably be entailed. These issues will, of course, be thoroughly debated, and I commend you for the kind of rule which you appear to be in the process of shaping. I would just like to say a word or two about the actual text of this bipartisan resolution itself, and I want to stress that it is bipartisan. I think it's terribly important that it be bipartisan, because whatever our differences may be, and they're real differences, they're heartfelt differences, they're legitimate differences, I would hope we can agree this is not a partisan issue. It's not a Democratic or Republican issue. It's an American issue, which each of us ought to respond to on the basis not of what is in the best interests of our party, but on the basis of what is in the best interests of our country.
I think the Speaker made that very clear at the caucus this morning. That
I think that's a tribute to the Speaker, and I assume the Minority Leader has probably said the same with respect to the members of the Republican conference. This resolution authorizes the President to use U.S. armed forces pursuant to the relevant Security Council resolutions that have been adopted with respect to the Gulf crisis. This is not, as some have characterized it, an abdication of responsibility. Some have said we give the sole and exclusive authority to determine whether to use force under this to the President. Truth of the matter is that this resolution is an assertion of congressional responsibility and of congressional prerogatives. The President of the United States has formally asked us to authorize the use of force in the Gulf. We are now responding to that request. I must say to my very dear friend from California, Mr. Bielenson, that there is no attempt in the language which has been included in this resolution to deceive anyone. And I believe that if this resolution is adopted, that no one will be deceived. It is very clear, the President has made this very clear, that if after January 15th, Iraq is not withdrawn from Kuwait, and this resolution is adopted, I don't think anybody will be able to say who voted for the resolution, once American forces are committed to combat, that they didn't know what they were voting for. I would say this is the functional equivalent of a declaration of war. We don't use that phrase, but there's no doubt about what it will mean in the event Iraq does not leave by the 15th. Finally, let me say, if I may, in conclusion, that those of us who sponsor this resolution, those who will support it in the House on both sides of the aisle, and the President himself, who has endorsed this resolution, all believe that the last best hope for peace and for the resolution of this crisis in a way which is compatible with our interests and our values, without requiring the resort to force, lies in the adoption of this resolution, thereby stripping Saddam Hussein of whatever lingering illusions he may have about the extent to which the Congress may stay the hand of the President. If we adopt this resolution, I believe it will send a clear and unmistakable signal to Saddam and his associates in the Iraqi leadership that the President has all the authority he needs and that the Congress of the United States stands behind him. Even then, he may not withdraw. And anybody who votes for this resolution thinking that we may not end up in war is making a mistake, because there's a very good chance we will end up in war. But at this late date, after Secretary Baker has been stiffed in Geneva without any indication of the slightest flexibility on the part of the Iraqis, I would submit that the adoption of a resolution like this represents the last best chance of convincing Iraq to withdraw in a way which is compatible with the relevant UN resolutions, thereby enabling us to avoid a war in the first place.
Mr. Chairman, now supporting the rule, I would assume, is our other distinguished leader on the Foreign Affairs Committee, who has the opposing resolution sponsored by a broad spectrum of members of the Congress, Mr. Hamilton, who stands 6 feet 2, by the way, by comparison. I used to be as tall and as handsome as Lee Hamilton when I came here, too, but I've been here longer than he has.
Boy, the force of gravity in your part of the country must be great.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Fasel. I usually find myself seated at the table with my colleagues here in full agreement. And one of the difficulties of this place is that from time to time you have to disagree with friends, and that's the case here. But it does not lower in any way my respect and admiration for them. I'll not get into the merits. I don't think you want to debate on that, although I was sorely tempted to here a moment ago. Simply to say that this is clearly one of the defining votes that each one of us will cast in our congressional careers. I very much hope that there will be no debate over procedure. I want to see a nice, clean vote on the policy options so that those who support the position that my colleagues have argued for and done so very persuasively will say, look, there were no procedural gimmicks here. We had our shot at it. And likewise, I would hope to be able to say that on our side of the resolution. So that's really my plea, that the issue should be presented cleanly and clearly, obviously with full time for debate and no gimmicks in the procedure, and that when we have that vote on the rule out there, whenever that occurs, that we will find, if not unanimous, then almost unanimous vote. And I have enormous confidence in you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Solomon to craft that kind of a proposal, and it certainly will have my support.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, Lee, one other thing. I suggested to the committee that you manage the time with regard to your resolution, let Solars manage the time with regard to the bipartisan resolution on the Democratic side. And I don't know what the Republicans will do in order to guide the committee in case they have to draft a rule in which they have to designate people. But that's all right.
That's fine with me, just so long as somebody gives me some relief now and then when sitting on the floor.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. It's a long time since we've had such a splendid display of congressional power at one table at the same time.
Well, Mr.
Other than when we meet every day.
Well, Mr. Chairman, let me just conclude, if I may, with one thing. The seriousness of this matter, and it's, all of us have to laugh once in a while, or we'd all go stark raving mad around here. But this is a serious matter, and a very important question was raised by members of your committee with regard to the meaning of the bipartisan resolution. The courts have already ruled on that question. There is no doubt about the fact that the Solar's resolution, as Charlie Bennett has said, meets the constitutional requirement. Once you do that, it's done. The constitutional test has been met. And if force is to be used, that is the authority for that basis. And it's very important to clarify that point. And that's the reason why the Bennett-Durbin resolution, frankly, as a concurrent resolution expressing the sense of Congress, simply is complementary to this matter. But that raises a different issue someplace else. It really doesn't have too much to do with this. And yet it's important. It's important. The other thing I wanted to stress is, as Mr. Gentleman from Texas brought out, is that we have an understanding here, legislatively at least, that there's compliance with war powers. Because what that section does is state compliance so that the clock is not triggered. We're saying in this, Mr. President, this complies with war powers, therefore the clock does not begin to run. You have the authority of Congress.
If the gentleman will yield.
Yes.
Since this is a resolution that will go to the President for his signature.
That's right.
It is more than just a statement of the legislature that the War Powers Act is complied
Absolutely.
with. Once the President signs this, then he is acknowledging compliance with the War Powers resolution, also something which he and previous presidents have resisted.
Mr. Frost, you're absolutely right. I can't judge what disclaimers would be filed in the future with regard to any legislation. And I don't know that the President will have changed his mind or denied himself any decision-making power with respect to the statement on the constitutionality of anything. I mean, he preserves that right all the time. And he might very well say in this case, well, that section is unconstitutional because the basic law is unconstitutional. I can't guarantee that he will not do that. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, it is an important restatement legislatively by the Congress that does not need to be overlooked. It's a very important precedent. So the constitutional test will have been met. Nobody should be under any illusion, Mr. Chairman, that in some way we have not empowered the President or that force would not be used if it became necessary. Because you're right, this is the moral, the practical, and the legal equivalent of a declaration. As Charlie Bennett put it in his own words, it's not necessary to have a blue ribbon with gold seals. Any act of the Congress might meet the constitutional requirement. I dare say, and I'm going to raise this in the debate because I think it's important, and you might want to, I don't know that it affects your rule one way or the other. I don't think it does. But the fact is that we in the Congress have already supported acts of war right now. And it may very well be that the constitutional test has already been met, either by appropriations or by acts. You don't think an embargo and boarding a vessel on the high sea is an act of war, Mr. Bielenson? Well, that's...
I don't think any of us, if I may respond, has consciously voted to declare war or to authorize
I understand that.
Up till this point.
I don't mean to put words in your mouth. I just say that facts are facts. You know, and you can interpret them any way you want. You can take any position you want. The fact is that we have done that. And so I'm just agreeing with Charlie Bennett, in other words. I think there are a lot of ways, and the courts have said there are a lot of ways you can meet the constitutional test. We are trying to comply with that in this resolution. It's a very important debate, in other words. And I only took this time to be sure that there is no misunderstanding about either the compliance with the Constitution or the actual effect if this is adopted. And it's not the first time that the Congress has enacted a provision with a condition subsequent. We have done that time after time, either in a formal sense or in a resolution sense. The Congress has done that. We are not setting a precedent.
Any questions, Mr. Bielenson?
Well, just one quick comment, Mr. Chairman, if I may. We seem to be in agreement on the process and the procedure.
Right.
There is no need for us to debate any further.
I didn't mean to raise the issue.
No,
Sorry.
not at all. It's been raised several times. It's fine. I simply wanted to respond to my good friend from New York, Mr. Solars, to say that I accept his statement. I appreciate his saying so clearly that adoption of the resolution of which he's co-sponsor or principal sponsor is in effect the declaration of war by the Congress. I'm not sure I prefer doing it that way. I still think we should be faced with a stark declaration of war, as our colleague from Texas, Mr. Washington, proposes. I do think it has sort of an innate seriousness, perhaps, that this doesn't have. But since we have all accepted this and the proponents themselves are saying it, I think we can take it at face value, and members will obviously appreciate the seriousness of their actions on Saturday when the vote is taken, and I appreciate my colleagues responding in that manner.
Any questions
Thank
over
you
here?
very much, Mr. Chairman. Oh,
Hold on,
excuse me.
Mr. Chairman.
I don't
Mr. Solomon?
I don't want to hold up these gentlemen, Mr. Chairman. I just have to say to my good friend, Mr. Solars, I have to repeat what he said. I never thought I would sit here, and having grown up with him in politics, and to see him asking for the authorization for a president to use military force. I really respect that gentleman, and I think the American people ought to be very comforted to see Mr. Vassell and Mr. Solars, along with Mr. Broomfield and Mr. Michael. I served on that committee for 10 years on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Those four gentlemen there, I think, represent over 100 years of expertise in this issue. And, you know, Mr. Vassell said this is a very, very serious matter. I think it goes even beyond that. You know, 40 years ago, the United Nations passed a resolution which started the containment policy of communism. First time for the authorization of force. And now 40 years later, they have done the same thing. In between that period of time, the UN did not work because of the Soviet Union and because we had a bipolar foreign policy between the two superpowers. That no longer exists. The Soviet Union is gone. The Soviet Union no longer can contain and control people like Saddam Hussein. And if you really want peace in the Mideast, in all of this area, if you picture that map, with Saudi Arabia, with Syria, with Egypt, and Israel, and Turkey, we have the greatest chance in the world if we are successful in driving Saddam Hussein back across the border, of making the United Nations be a successful operation for the future when some Ayatollah wants to cross a border, when Syria wants to invade. You know, we could solve almost the Palestinian issue if we're successful here. That's how important it is to all of you. And that's why I just commend the four of you for having brought this resolution. It's going to mean a great deal for freedom in the world to come. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can I just take the liberty of thanking a gentleman from New York for trying to clothe me with expertise, and I have been here a long time. Only claim I make is called common sense, Mr. Solomon, and this is what I've tried to apply in this very difficult case.
You sure have.
Mr. Frost.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be brief. I just want to underline a point that one or two others have made. Saddam Hussein should not take any comfort in the fact that there are differences of opinion openly and freely expressed in a democratic society. We are going to arrive at a result, and I would think that there's a high likelihood that your resolution will pass. The fact that there are people who have differences of opinion and that can be expressed openly in a democratic country should not give him any comfort at all.
Absolutely, Mr. Frost. It's the strength of our society, not the weakness of our society.
And I would submit, if I may, that the fact that no debate like this will be taking place in the Iraqi parliament is one of the reasons I am confident that at the end of the day we will prevail, because ultimately this is the source of our strength, not the source of our weakness.
Mr. Quillen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this resolution sends the proper message to Hussein. We shouldn't shadow box, we shouldn't play around, we should hit hard and fast and you gentlemen have come up with the right answer, agreeing with the President of the United States, and I commend all of you. We cannot stand idly by and let the foreign minister slap the President of the United States in the face by refusing to deliver the President's message to his boss. I think it's time that we stood firm, do whatever is necessary, and this resolution gives the President that option. Thank you all.
Are you speaking as a member of the Post Office Committee or of the Rules Committee?
I'm speaking not only as a member of this committee, but I'm speaking as an American.
Okay. Any, Mr. Wheat?
I don't want to belabor the debate here today. I do want to add, as a person who will not be able to support your resolution due to my own belief that the sanctions ought to be given more time to work, that I would amplify Mr. Frost's remarks that ultimately, whether it is the sanctions or whether it is military force, I think the resolve of the American people is clear, and that the nation of Iraq will be forced to abandon their brutal conquest of Kuwait. For the purpose of this committee and for Mr. Washington's benefit, though, I would like to have the question answered. He has proposed a very simple resolution that would be an explicit statement that we declare war upon the nation of Iraq. And if you gentlemen could explain just very briefly why you don't consider that language preferable to the language that's included in the resolution, I'd appreciate it.
Well, to begin with, in all of the prior deliberations we had on this, the suggestion was not made because nobody thought it was necessary. As Chairman Fasell said, the language we have is the political, moral, and legislative equivalent for declaration of war. There may, however, be some marginal benefit in not using those words. For one thing, as I understand it, the actual use of those words triggers certain legislation or rights on the part of the President we may not yet want to do. We can always come to that later on if we so choose. Secondly, we chose, I think, not to include that phrase because we continue to believe this can be resolved without war. And we think that one way to resolve it without war is not to declare war, but to make it clear that we're ready to go to war if he doesn't withdraw. It's a small point, but it's a fine point. I see, in other words, no benefit at this point to be gained by putting those precise words in the resolution. If there are, however, 10, 15, 20 members who would be prepared to vote for the resolution with those words in it, who would otherwise vote against it with those words out, perhaps it could be considered. But absent those kinds of considerations, I see no benefits to including it, and I see some potential drawback. But I think Mr. Washington and those who may share his views on this can take some comfort from the fact that unlike the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, where rightly or wrongly there were members who voted for that resolution who subsequently argued that they had no idea that this was going to ultimately be cited as the justification for sending 500,000 Americans to Vietnam, if this bipartisan resolution is adopted and on January 15th or 16th or February 1st, and the precise moment will be chosen by the President, as it should be, we go to war, no one is going to be able to say, I was deceived, I didn't know what I was voting for, because it will be very clear that that is precisely what they're voting for. Let me make one other point on this. It is true that if this resolution passes, the decision as to when to actually use force is left to the President. May I say that even if we use the phrase declaration of war, the decision would still rest with the President. You could have a sitzkrieg. A declaration of war is not self-executing. The President could choose to keep not to send the forces into combat. So in that sense, I think even if you use the phrase declaration of war, you still end up leaving in the hands of the President the precise decision and judgment about when to give the order to send forces into combat. Consequently, I have to say I truly believe it is a non-issue.
May I just amplify that a little bit? There are 17 pages here that we have in the Foreign Affairs Committee of laws that would be triggered if you use the formal language, we do hereby declare war. Because the Congress, in passing these laws, used that language, state-of-the-art language, for the trigger mechanism. So you got all kinds of emergency powers and a whole host of other actions that are deemed unnecessary. Secondly, let me just read a very brief court decision, okay, because this matter was raised. An attempt to require a declaration of war as the only permissible form of assent might involve unforeseeable domestic and international consequences without any obvious compensating advantages other than a formal declaration of war does have special solemnity and does present to the legislature an unambiguous choice. Still the court's language. While those advantages are not negligible, we deem it a political question, or to phrase it more accurately, a discretionary matter for Congress to decide in which form, if any, it will give its consent to war. That is, we regard the Constitution as contemplating various forms of congressional assent, and we do not find any authority in the courts to require Congress to employ rather than one form rather than another. So for a lot of reasons, most of which is that we didn't want to get into the complication of kicking in all these other statutes, we did not use that language because the moral, political, and legal equivalent is exactly the same. That's the real answer in my judgment.
I thank the gentleman for their response and thank the chairman for the opportunity.
Thank you. Mr. Dreyer.
Mr. Chairman, the very existence of this panel and this resolution and the potential for its passage demonstrates that once again we're getting back to the concept that partisanship does end at the water's edge, and I think that's a very positive sign. We know that the world is going to be following closely the debate over the next 2 days on the floor of the Congress, and I hope very much that as we proceed with all of the options available, that we're able to, through the debate process, set an example, not only for Saddam Hussein, but for others throughout the world. And I think that, you know, I always use this phrase, look for the silver lining in the dark cloud. And I think that over the next couple of days, we're going to be able to provide for the world an example which can be a very important one. And I thank the gentleman for their work.
Well, I thank you. I'm sure that the American people will see heated debate, important debate, serious debate, the very essence of the whole system.
Gentlelady from New York, Ms. Slaughter.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'd like to take advantage of having all of you here to satisfy my curiosity a moment. I think one of the biggest questions that all of us still have in this country is how we got to this spot. And a number of questions hanging out there. And in that regard, I wonder, has the Foreign Affairs Committee talked to Ambassador April Glaspie?
Go ahead, Steve.
I don't believe the committee has had a formal hearing before which the ambassador has appeared, but I have spoken to her personally. Let me just tell you as a personal aside that the very first trip I took as a member of Congress in February of 1975, after I had arrived here and was appointed to the Foreign Affairs Committee, was to the Middle East. And my control officer, when I got to Cairo, was a young woman by the name of April Glaspie, who was in the political section of our embassy in Egypt. And I got to know her over the years, and I watched her career as she climbed the ladder.
She's very highly respected, I understand.
So I know her fairly well, and we had a long talk after she got back here following the outbreak of war. In fact, I was supposed to see her in Baghdad a week after the invasion began. I was on a trip to the Middle East, and I had planned to visit Iraq, but then they invaded Kuwait. And when I read that Saddam had given a speech in which he said he would pluck out the eyes of anyone who opposed Iraq, I decided to pass up the opportunity.
Well, may I say to the gentlewoman from New York, you raised a good question. We're not going to solve that right now, but it hasn't been forgotten. The trouble with going back with those issues, and I've been on many committees which have tried to do that on other important matters, believe me, including the Committee on Foreign Affairs, And it's amazing how difficult it is to keep tracing back to get to the headwater to find out if there was a single act that was responsible. I don't believe you're going to find that. Now, whether or not because of misguided judgments or because of our policies in the past, we could have done better, or whatever the reasons. You know, I'm not sure we'll ever get the full answer to that. We were unhappy, for example, in the Foreign Affairs Committee, where a majority of us on both sides had supported sanctions against Iraq early. We were unhappy when at one time it was a policy with a broad spectrum, both political parties supporting assistance to Iraq for agricultural products.
I remember that.
And the sales of equipment.
Right.
And we did our best to try to stop that. Now, one could say that that was a mistake now, and looking back, we picked the wrong side, we should have picked the other side, or whatever. You know, we can say a lot of things in our mistake. In our policy, one could go back, for example, as far as when we were supporting, the United States, were supporting a revolutionary group, or a rebel group, if you will, in Iraq, and all of a sudden we changed our policy. And the Kurds have been in trouble ever since. So, you know, where do you start is what I'm trying to say.
Well, and certainly hindsight is not what I'm trying to practice here. What I'm just saying is it seems to me that's an integral part of the story of how we got to this
No question
position.
about that.
And inasmuch as the meeting took place a week before the invasion, I would surely love to know personally, if I could.
What was said.
I would.
If I may say to the gentlewoman from New York that according to the transcript of Ambassador Gillespie's meeting with Saddam Hussein, which the Iraqis released, and which has not yet been officially contradicted.
That's right. I think that's one of the major questions.
Presumably acting under instructions, not speaking just for herself, said, we, meaning the United States, do not take a position on these intra-Arab disputes. And in case anything was left to the imagination, she went on to say, such is your border dispute with Kuwait. Now, I have to say that I think this was a very serious mistake. It was, in fact, exactly the same mistake that Dean Acheson and Douglas MacArthur made 40 years ago when they publicly defined South Korea outside of the American defense perimeter in Asia, thereby giving Kim Il-sung and presumably Stalin, who gave him the go-ahead, the impression that he could get away with an invasion of South Korea.
Steve, that's real hindsight.
To the Korean War. By giving Saddam the impression that we would not come to the defense of Kuwait, I fear that we sent a wrong signal and helped create the situation in which we now find ourselves. But that's water under the bridge. Now we have to figure out how to get out of it.
I just hope we don't wade that same water. Thank you.
Mr. McEwen,
Mr. Chairman, my only question would be that I agree that no degree of rhetoric or hyperbole can overstate the import of this resolution, and would just ask the sponsors if it's their intent to seek additional co-sponsors or if they have concluded that effort.
Yeah, I think we would welcome additional co-sponsors. There has been an effort to establish a bipartisan balance on this because we think that sends a message consistent with that. I think we
Mr.
would.
Chairman, one final thought, and members of the committee, you've been very patient, and I have not addressed this, and I don't know how my colleagues feel about it. I would hope that these issues could be clearly put to the members of the House in the debate, and that because of the unusual circumstances, that no amendments would be permitted. The issues are patently clear, the resolutions are clear, members have a good concept of exactly whether they want to use force or whether they want to allow sanctions to run and not use force at this time. If we have any additional amendments, as good as they may be, it would simply dilute the debate from the principal issue, and we need to stay on the principal issue. The Congress of the United States needs to speak clearly, yes or no.
Would the gentleman yield at that time?
Gentleman, I yield. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Solomon.
I would just say that I certainly concur in that request, and certainly there are, all three sides on this issue are being heard. I don't feel that anyone on our Republican side of the aisle is being gagged in any way, and certainly we would support a mutual agreement between the Republican and Democratic leadership to hold it to these three issues.
Mr. Derrick.
Let me, I'd like to proceed just one moment further with the question that Ms. Slaughter brought up. You say that's water under the bridge. Well, maybe it is water under the bridge. But, the thing that worries me, and I'm probably going to support your resolution, but the thing that worries me is that most of us are so ill-informed on all of the facts about what we're voting on. Now, I have just learned today of this conversation with our former ambassador, Gillespie, I guess is the correct pronunciation. And from what I get out of it, we told Saddam Hussein that the least we told him was that we were indifferent to whether he came into Kuwait or not, and probably he had every reason to think that we wouldn't do anything. Now, you say that's water under the dam, but I'll tell you one thing, it doesn't give me a great deal of confidence in what's going on up at the White House right now. I mean, how are we to be told this and then yet to believe everything else that we're being told?
Yeah. Mr. Derrick? May I respond?
Oh, certainly. That's why I stopped.
Because I think you've raised a very serious
I think that's unconscionable.
I believe I could give you chapter and verse of what, in my judgment, in retrospect, were a whole series of mistakes that were made by the administration and to some extent by the Congress prior to August 2nd. Since August 2nd, however, I think it has to be said, and I say this as a Democrat, that the President has handled this crisis with extraordinary skill and effectiveness. He has marshaled unprecedented international support. We've not only got the majority of the UN, we've got the Soviet Union basically in support of our policy. I think 26 countries are participating in the coalition. A majority of the Arab League is with us. The sanctions which have been imposed are literally unprecedented in the history of the world. Whether they'll be sufficient to get Iraq out of Kuwait is a separate question. But the extent of the sanctions is truly impressive. And I think for this exercise in coalition diplomacy, the President deserves great credit. Finally, let me say that personally, having spoken about this in some detail with the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Powell, and I said this to him as recently as yesterday, one of the reasons I feel comfortable supporting this resolution is because Colin Powell is Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Because I have confidence in the rationality, in the wisdom, in the judgment, and the effectiveness of this man. And I must say, with his other top people whom I've met, General Schwarzkopf out in the region elsewhere, these people know what they're doing. I think they've studied the past. I think they've absorbed the right lessons. And I think we can proceed with some confidence
with all due
stewardship
respect,
for the country is
all that you may say is true, but it doesn't have a thing to do with what I'm talking about. I mean, all of that may be true, but if what I am led to believe is true about what happened with our ambassador, sure, we've handled a situation very well that we created to begin with.
Well,
or at least if we didn't create it, we certainly did an awful lot to lead Saddam Hussein to believe that we wouldn't do it.
Butler,
and because we lead Saddam Hussein to believe that if he comes into Kuwait, which we've known forever that he wanted to do to begin with, that we weren't going to do anything, so we end up with 450,000 troops over and find ourselves in this position. I mean, I think that's just absolutely absurd.
Yeah.
Amazing.
But Mr. Derrick, exactly the same argument could have been made in June of 1950 when the North Korean divisions
I don't want to talk about all that,
across
Mr. Solomon. I read history too. I know my history lessons just as well as you do. So we're talking about 1991 right now in January.
Let me suggest that despite the error that may have been made, okay, there's no.
Why have we known that?
Wait, excuse me. I don't know.
I mean, why haven't we been told this? Why weren't we told this back in August? Why weren't we told it in September?
It's been in the press, but
Well, it
it's
hadn't
been widely commented on,
widely reported.
with all due respect.
With all due respect, but I don't know of any evidence where the United States, as a matter of policy, directly supported an invasion of Kuwait.
Yeah. I didn't say.
No, I know. I didn't say you did.
They were certainly led Saddam Hussein to believe that he was that we were indifferent to what he did.
I understand that. I understand that. I'm just for the moment, being devil's advocate here on a point that is well made. The United States did not invite or support the taking of American hostages. The United States did not invite or support. This is despite any diplomatic errors that were made, okay? We did not invite or support the destruction of the infrastructure of Kuwait and the killing of a lot of people. We did not do that. We did not invite the pressure on Saudi Arabia.
I think you made your point.
You think so?
Yeah, the point's well taken. I'm not arguing that.
Let me just say one thing, and I'm going to quit. And I guess the bottom line of what I'm saying is that I have supported our president and what he's done, and how am I to have confidence in what I'm being told about what's going over there now?
It takes a great deal.
I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry, Mr. Solo.
But let me say one thing in fairness to the administration, because I happen to believe they did not handle the situation prior to August 2nd well. They can point to statements that were made by various spokesmen for the administration in the period immediately prior to the invasion, when the Iraqi buildup was taking place, that we would view with grave concern any use of force to resolve this crisis. Having said that, I do believe that the ambassador's statement to Saddam Hussein must have left him with the impression that we would perhaps grumble a little bit, but certainly not respond in the way we did. In that sense, it was clearly a mistake. But the question I think that confronts us now is, how do we deal with the consequences of that in a way which is consistent with our fundamental national interest?
I agree with that, Mr. Solos, but I think the question also is, in view of that, how do we trust what we're being told, and how do we trust the judgments that are being made?
Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Hall.
Mr. Chairman, I wanted to ask a question of Mr. Hamilton. He's left. But the one thing that is not very clear to me, it's in regard to the rule and the members having a chance to speak on both sides of the point. Most of the people we've had up here today have been very pro-Solar's resolution, very strong resolution, and Lee did mention that he wanted to have some time, but I don't think it's clear, because when members want to speak for or especially against the resolution, I'm not quite sure who they know who to go to. And so we better be very clear in the rule.
Well, on general
so that
debate,
members, when they're looking to speak, they
on
know
general
where to
debate,
go.
we divide it between the minority and the majority, so everybody will have a chance to speak on it. The majority and minority leaders, and they'll pass the time on it.
Mr. Hall, I suggested at the beginning that the thing to do would be to let the chief sponsors of both resolutions manage the time, so that everybody would have an opportunity to speak, both Republicans and Democrats.
Well, it's not.
But I don't care how you do it, whatever way is fair.
It's not a criticism. It's a question that I don't think it was very clear to me when we started talking about it, and I think that'll probably
on
handle
general
the
debate, it'll be handled by the minority and majority leaders. When it gets down to the specific resolutions, of course, then the players will be assigned the time.
But
that's fine.
You might want to consider, Mr. Chairman, a provision which says that whoever manages the time should be allocated in a way that it is equally distributed amongst proponents and opponents of the particular resolution under debate.
Well, actually, we also have a provision in the rule that the time may be extended by the mutual agreement of the minority and majority leaders.
But what I mean, for example, is let us say you accepted the suggestion of Mr. Fasell that I be designated to manage the time for the Democrats when the bipartisan resolution comes up. Presumably, Mr. Broomfield would manage it for the Republicans. The argument might be made you have two proponents of the resolution managing the time. I would want you to know that it would certainly be my intention to make sure that in allocating our share of the time, it would be allocated equally among opponents as well as proponents.
That's the way it's going to be done. It's going to be divided equally between the opponent and proponent.
1 hour segment.
That's right.
Would the chairman yield?
I yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Solomon.
It's also the intention of the Republicans to, of the half-time that they are yielded, to yield equal time to the opponents on the Republican side, of which there are.
Because, you know, at that point, even though we will have had general debate, the effort to focus, it's going to have to be done very sharply in order to cover the respective points of view. We're going to have to really hone in on it, because that 1 hour will go.
Well, the leaders on both sides are going to be very sensitive to the time request, and I'm sure this rule
it'll be fair.
will be handled fairer than anything
Mr. Chairman,
else that might be coming out.
What is your judgment on when the rule will hit the floor?
As soon as you get out of here. No, actually, it should be around...
Thank you very much.
It'll be sometime, probably within an hour. All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Steve.
The committee will be very happy to hear from the congressman in Washington.
Is he the minister going to testify?
Yeah.
What do you think on 4 o'clock on the floor?
I'll find out just to see how much time we need. Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. There's an overriding overlap, if you will, between the position in which we find ourselves historically in terms of the situation in the Persian Gulf. And I'd like to accept response to questions, limit myself to the reasons why I think it's necessary to come forward with a straightforward resolution. There is the potential, at least for, in my view, a constitutional crisis, Mr. Chairman, that exists with respect to the plain meaning, I believe, of the Constitution, which sets out in the 11th clause of the 8th section of the first article of the Constitution. And from what I've heard from the discussion today, I'm convinced now more than ever that unless a resolution, unless the members get an opportunity to vote straightforward up or down on the resolution, that the Congress will not have expressed its will in the manner contained in the Constitution. I believe that there's no question about what ifs in the event of an attack upon our forces, which are presently located in that region by the forces of President Saddam Hussein, that there's no need to resort to the Constitution. I believe that those are, if you will, peripheral issues, and I think the central issue is whether the Congress must make a declaration of war before we go into an offensive posture. That is, whether before the President is authorized to have our forces attack other forces who have not attacked us, that the Congress must act. There's no question but what, at least a plain reading.
All right. Continue, Mr. Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A plain reading of the Federalist Papers, from which, of course, develops the colloquy that supports the provisions of the Constitution. First of all, that the Constitution is flexible. I don't think it makes any difference how far troops have to march before they are engaged in battle. I think that the forefathers were perceptive enough in their choice of words to make clear, except in a few rare exceptions, and the Congress in those cases has found it necessary to amend the Constitution, but I think the Constitution is flexible enough to see us well through these times. My fear is that if we avoid the direct issue of whether Congress wishes to declare war, then we allow the historians and legal scholars and others room, if you will, to manipulate the interpretation. Let me speak more directly. And I'm not critical of any of the resolutions. I think that they ought to be debated on the floor, and I intend to carry the substance of my remarks, be it the will of the committee, to report H.J. Res. 63 as well, that the proper forum for the discussion of that is on the floor of the House of Representatives. And I believe in that context, if the Congress finds no merit in the position that I hold, then of course they can vote that down. But my fear is that we leave a gap, that there's a tiny crevice, if you will, that if you can walk a narrow line between all of these, from the present legal situation, I mean historical, factual situation, to the ultimate legal situation. And you can, with respect to each one of these, I try to make up a little chart, starting with, say, Bennett Durbin, and of course I'm not being critical of any of them, but the reason that I'm here is because I fundamentally believe that the position that I hold is correct, and if not, then Congress in its wisdom will do the appropriate thing. Let's start with Bennett Durbin. Bennett Durbin, first of all, I have a serious problem with underlining words or putting an exclamation point after something that needs no highlighting. I think that Congressman Wheat addressed that point. Why would it be necessary for the Congress in its wisdom to restate what is in the Constitution? There's no question about the supremacy of constitutional law as opposed to statute law. What is in our Constitution is in concrete. The only way that it can be changed or subject to a different interpretation would be by a constitutional amendment or by an interpretation of the court, and we've had neither. I find it, frankly, unsettling, and this is no disrespect to these members. They have much more seniority, of course, in this Congress and more acumen on the specific issue than I do. But if that wall is white, and it is, it doesn't need for any of us to say so. The Constitution says what it says, and it doesn't need, in fact, it does nothing more in my judgment but to demean the Constitution for the Congress to have to pass a resolution, which is a concurrent resolution, which has not the force and effect of law, to reiterate or reaffirm what the Constitution says. Either it means what it says or it doesn't mean anything at all. And as I said, that's not to be critical. The test of that on each one of these is what happens if the president ignores it. If the president ignores H-Con Res 1, in all due respect, nothing happens. And it's not a test of whether we want to get into an irresistible force versus immovable object position with the president. I think that we ought to support the president. I think that we ought to support the Constitution and the Congress, and I think we ought to make sure that there's no question but what the Constitution is being followed. That is, the president has made the request now. There's no more argument about whether the request is made. If we follow with less than a forthright direct response, I think we leave a gap. Let's move on to the bipartisan SOLARs. It is a condition subsequent. And I, again, have a serious question as a lawyer that if the Constitution gives us the right and indeed the authority and the duty to make a determination as to whether we should declare war, first of all, it doesn't mean that the president would exercise that authority immediately. It doesn't obviate present ongoing diplomatic relations and others that may occur, but it gives the president unquestionably the hammer that he needs in order to make sure that Saddam Hussein and others know that he is speaking clearly with the authority of this government. But if you put a condition subsequent on it, quite frankly, from a political point of view, you do one thing off the top, and I'm not suggesting that's anyone's motive. You give people a place to hide, because they can say, well, I voted for the resolution, but it didn't occur to me, let's not even say it didn't occur to me, but the conditions subsequent were not met. When the president committed forces to offensive action, let's look at the SOLAR, look at the language itself. The president had not, quote, made the determination that he had used all appropriate diplomatic and other peaceful, or I disagree with his statement that he did, or subparagraph 2, that those efforts had not been and would not be successful. You leave people a place to hide. The president, if we're going to go to war, needs to have the American people and the Congress behind him. But the Congress needs to go on record. We ought not leave this man out there by himself. If we think that conditions exist such that we should declare war, then by God, we ought to say so. And if we think the conditions are not yet met where we ought to declare war, then we ought to say so. But we oughtn't leave the president out on the limb, and I think respectfully to the persons who have, the chairman and these other people have a lot more seniority than I ever hope to attain here in the Congress, because I think Mr. Solomon said I'd have to stay here 100 years, and I don't plan on living that long. But in all seriousness, first of all, the question as to whether you can declare war in this fashion is left open to scholars and others to debate it. And I think we ought to be clear. We ought to cut with a meat cleaver, just as straight and clean as you can do, one way or the other. As far as the Hamilton-Gephardt proposal to allow sanctions to continue to operate, I think, I have not seen it, but I'm given to understand that it has some language in it that would require ultimately the president to come to the Congress. The bottom line is, one other thing, then I'll be finished. Some argue that the United Nations, that our adopting the United Nations treaty obviated the necessity for the president to get a specific declaration of war. I've seen writings to that effect in Youngstown Steel Company, which dealt with President Truman's treatment and nationalizing of the steel industry during the Korean conflict. Without arguing the merits of that, certainly not arguing them in this place, it seems to me that it's difficult to make the argument that indirectly the United Nations Charter and the Senate's ratification of it, which did not require parenthetically the participation of the House of Representatives, and I've been given to understand that the only means of amending our Constitution is set out in the Constitution, and that ain't one of them. But assuming for the sake of discussion, and I'll be brief, that is apparent, why then does not the same United Nations Charter override the constitutions of Japan and Germany, which they hide behind and say that that's the reason they can send money, but they can't send soldiers. They can vote for these efforts, but they don't send soldiers to participate in these efforts. Whatever the United Nations Charter does, it does for all of the signatories to it and not just for the United States. I think that's a red herring to suggest that you can leap over the United States constitutional provision, which is very clear, written by Madison, that the Congress and only the Congress can declare war. And this is a straight up vote on it, and I think that the members of the Congress ought to have an opportunity to express themselves directly, and I think that we oughtn't have any place to hide, quite frankly. The president has not looked for a place to hide, nor is he looking for one now. I think the Congress shouldn't have any place to hide. This is not a partisan issue. If I'd been a member of the Congress when President Johnson was here during the Vietnam, my position would have been the same, or when President Truman was here. It doesn't have anything to do with partisan politics to me. It has to do with what's right and what's wrong. And what's right is that the Constitution be followed. Because if Saddam Hussein can make us venture from our constitutional democracy, regardless of whether he wins the war or not, he wins in the long run. Because if we cheapen the laws that we have fought and died to respect in his name or in order to get him, then regardless of the outcome of the conflict, it seems to me that the view of us in the eyes of the world is dimmed a little bit because we have circumvented our own Constitution in the name of reaching out to get one man. I'll be happy to attempt to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Congressman. Any questions? Gentleman from Texas, any questions?
As usual, the gentleman is extremely articulate.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I ask unanimous consent that the statement, an amendment by Representative Dorgan be put in the record, and also the concurrent resolution by Representative Trafficant be put in the record. No, that goes in. I thought we were going to go to. The chair will be in receipt of a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant one rule providing for consideration in the House of 3 measures: a concurrent resolution expressing the sense of Congress that Congress must approve any offensive military action against Iraq if offered by Representative Bennett, Durbin, or their designee; a concurrent resolution regarding United States policy to reverse Iraq's occupation of Kuwait; if offered by Representative Gephardt, Hamilton, or their designee, and a joint resolution authorizing the use of United States Armed Forces pursuant to United States Security Council Resolution 678, if offered by Representative Michael or his designee. The text of these resolutions will be printed in the Rules Committee report to accompany the rule. Each resolution will be debatable in the House for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and a member opposed. The rule provides 12 hours of general debate on the situation in the Middle East, equally divided and controlled by the majority and minority leader. After consulting with the minority leader, it will be in order for the majority leader or his designee to move to extend the period of debate, and the motion will not be debatable. After general debate is concluded, it will be in order to consider the Bennett-Durbin concurrent resolution. After the Bennett-Durbin concurrent resolution is disposed of, it will be in order to consider the Gephardt-Hamilton concurrent resolution. After the Gephardt-Hamilton concurrent resolution is disposed of, it will be in order to consider the Michael joint resolution. The rule provides for one motion to commit if offered by Representative Michael or his designee on the joint resolution.
You've heard the motion of the gentleman from South Carolina. Any discussion? Mr. Solomon.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to make note that Mr. Fasell and Mr. Solars had asked that the Solars-Michael resolution be considered in the second position of the three. The rule puts them in the third position, but I guess it's fair to everybody, and I just want to thank you and Speaker Foley and the rest of the member on your side of the aisle for this opportunity that we're going to have to debate the issue on the floor, and I think everybody will have their opportunity to be heard.
The gentleman yield just a minute. You know, as I understood it, Mr. Michael originally thought that he wanted a second, but he said in his testimony that he had decided it really made no difference anyway suited.
That is correct.
In fact, I met with the Speaker Foley last night, and his desire to be ultimately fair. I mean, we were talking about normal procedure, and then King of the Mountains, and that would have given someone the edge. And we couldn't think of a better solution, a legislative solution, where everybody would be treated fairly than the process we came up with today.
Again, I commend the gentleman. I think you have been.
All right, thank you. Any further discussion on it, Mr. Weed?
Rather awkward position in as much as I don't believe at this time, personally, that we ought to authorize a declaration of war, but I do think that Mr. Washington has made an articulate argument as to why those who do believe that we ought to authorize force should have the opportunity to do so in the form of an explicit declaration of war as opposed to the language that is included in the Solars Amendment. And I would offer an amendment at that time that a Washington amendment to the Solars resolution be in order.
But for the committee's knowledge, as you well know, this matter is a very delicate situation, and we worked it out with the majority, minority, and all the arrangements have been made. And if we, and I applaud the gentleman from Texas. I thought he made a great argument, but I would be just afraid that we'd throw the entire legislative process out of being, and we wouldn't be able to get to the floor tonight. It may forestall a lot of things from happening, and a lot of arrangements would have been broken. But the gentleman absolutely has got a right to offer the amendment at the proper time.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Frost.
This is it's a very difficult situation that we face. I have enormous regard for my colleague from Texas, and I think that the points that he made were very valid. He was here, I think, during most of the testimony, and I believe that every witness who was asked, regardless of where they were on the merits on the underlying issue, stated that in their opinion the Solars resolution was the equivalent of a declaration of war. I understand the points made by the gentleman, and I wish that I could support the gentleman's resolution. Mr. Weed has accurately stated his view, and the chairman has accurately stated the parliamentary situation. And I wish that I could vote in favor of the chairman making the gentleman's resolution in order, but I cannot.
Mr. Solomon.
Mr. Chairman, there's no no other member of Congress that speaks out in this committee or on the floor for other members' rights to be heard. And I just personally happen to think that the Solars Fasel-Michael resolution accomplishes what the gentleman wants to accomplish, although he and I would disagree on it. I think people from both sides of the aisle and the White House have spent many weeks trying to put together this compromise where members could be heard on the floor. And I would have to vote against the gentleman's amendment and just hope that the gentleman would continue to try to push his philosophy to come before this committee whenever he sees fit.
Any other discussion? Question comes on the motion, the gentleman from South Carolina. Gentleman from Mr. Wheat, do you want to propose your amendment now?
I would offer the amendment, as I previously stated it, to make the Washington amendment in order to the Solars resolution.
Question comes on the motion, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Wheat. Missouri, I'm sorry, Mr. Wheat. Is there any further discussion? If not on the motion, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. The noes appear to have it. Any other amendments? If not, the question now comes on the motion, the gentleman from South Carolina. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted.
Mr. Chairman,
the gentleman from South Carolina.
I ask consent that the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes in the rules adopted today.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman from New York.
I might just make an inquiry so that all members will have time to be notified. I would hope that the rule would not be taken up before 4 o'clock. That's 30 minutes, so we could have a chance to notify our membership that this may be coming up.
I've been informed that the Speaker and the Minority Leader are talking right now to determine what time this will be taken up. So I don't think it'll be taken up before 4 o'clock.
We assume the Minority Leader will let you know.
Yes. Where are we? All right. The rule will be carried by the chairman, and the committee will. Yeah, the committee will be in recess, subject to call of the chair in case there is any other last-minute things that may come up.
Did a good job.
Okay, thank you.
Did a good job.
Thank you.
Joe, can you give me 6 minutes on
A note that the House of Representatives is scheduled to vote on the 3 resolutions that will be brought to the House floor concerning the use of military force in the Persian Gulf. That's Saturday at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, and C-SPAN will bring you live gavel-to-gavel coverage as members continue 3 hours of general debate and then 1 hour of debate on each of the 3 resolutions. Again, that's Saturday at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, 6 a.m. on the West Coast.
C-SPAN, the cable satellite public affairs network, and its companion network, C-SPAN 2, are brought to you as a public service.